Donald Trump announced about Barron. The host, on air, stunned the entire studio. The studio lights blazed brightly. Cameras panned slowly across the audience, capturing faces filled with anticipation. All eyes were locked on the center stage where two chairs faced each other. A man stepped out. He wore a dark suit, his tie so tight it looked suffocating. His smile was professional but sharp. Matthew Johnson, the renowned host of the LTV Night Show, was ready for the most anticipated interview of the year. Across from him, a tall figure with distinctive blonde hair entered. No introduction was needed. Donald Trump walked in with his trademark confidence. He was dressed in a black suit and a bold red tie, a signature look. Some audience members cheered. Others remained silent, waiting to see what would unfold. Matthew took his seat, adjusted his microphone, and locked eyes with Trump. The game had begun. "Mr. Trump, thank you for being here tonight." Trump nodded, arms crossed. "My pleasure." Matthew Johnson smirked, glancing down at the script in front of him. He knew the audience was waiting for a bombshell moment, a question that could catch the former president off guard. And he had just the one. "Let's get straight to it," Matthew said, setting his paper down. "There's a question millions of people have been asking. Have you ever taken a DNA test for Barron Trump?" The studio went dead silent. The camera zoomed in on Trump's face. But he didn't flinch, frown, or lean forward in anger. He simply sat there, calm, watching the man across from him. "Do you even realize what you just said?" Trump asked slowly. Matthew chuckled lightly, maintaining his composure. "I'm just asking a question that the public wants to know. Many have raised suspicions." "So that's the purpose of your show?" Trump interrupted. "To question the legitimacy of a 17-year-old boy just because the media has nothing else to hold on to?" A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Not everyone agreed with Matthew's approach. The host straightened in his chair, unwilling to lose control. "Mr. Trump, let me explain." Before he could finish, a sudden noise came from the audience. All heads turned. In the back row, a middle-aged woman was trembling. Her grip on her handbag was so tight that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes brimmed with tears, lips quivering as if she had something urgent to say but couldn't. Trump looked toward her. So did everyone else. "Do you have something to say?" he asked. The woman shook her head at first, but her gaze remained locked on Trump. One of her hands clutched a thick manila folder. Finally, as if unable to hold back any longer, she stood up. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice breaking. Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Who are you?" "My name is Sarah Anderson," she said, tears rolling down her face. "And I never meant to offend your family, Mr. Trump. I was desperate." Matthew frowned. This wasn't what he had expected. Trump studied her. Desperate for what? Sarah clenched the folder in her hands. "My son Tommy is 14 years old and already over 6 feet 4 inches. He's growing too fast, and doctors say he might have a rare condition. But I can't afford the genetic test. I sent this question to the show not to attack your family. I just wanted to know." Her voice cracked, unable to continue. Trump remained silent. So did the entire studio. Matthew blinked rapidly, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control. He quickly attempted to steer the conversation back. "Can we return to the main topic?" he interjected. "We're here to discuss Barron Trump." Trump didn't take his eyes off Sarah. He nodded slowly, as if piecing everything together. Then he turned back to Matthew. "Oh, I think we're talking about something much more important now." Matthew froze. "What do you mean?" Trump smiled slightly, but his eyes were razor-sharp. "I'll show you." He reached under the table and pulled out a thick folder, raising it for all to see. "I know about Tommy's case," he said firmly. "And I know about many other children like him." Gasps echoed across the room. Matthew's mouth opened slightly in shock. Trump continued. 3 months ago, when this question was submitted to your show, I had it investigated. Not for a scandal, but because I wanted to know why a mother would ask something like this on national television." He flipped open the file. Tommy's medical records, doctor visits, total hospital bills, $147,800. His family has seen 17 specialists, sold their car, and taken on 3 extra jobs to survive. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "And do you know what we did?" Trump asked, voice steady. "The Trump Foundation paid off Tommy's medical bills last week." The studio erupted. Some audience members gasped, others started clapping. Sarah sobbed uncontrollably. Matthew sat motionless. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. Trump leaned forward, locking eyes with him. So now, let's really talk about DNA. But not the way you wanted. The studio sat in stunned silence, the atmosphere heavy with disbelief. Everyone was watching, waiting for the next move. Trump's voice was steady as ever, but there was a steel-like determination behind his words. He had turned the tables, and now it was his moment to show the world what really mattered. You want to talk about DNA, Matthew? Fine. Let's talk about it. Trump leaned forward, the intensity in his voice undeniable. Matthew Johnson, the once confident host who had set out to make a name for himself with a scandalous question, was now visibly rattled. His carefully rehearsed plans were crumbling in real time, and he could feel the weight of the studio's eyes on him, silently judging his every word. Mr. Trump, Matthew began, his usual confidence faltering. But Trump cut him off, raising a hand to silence him. No more games, Trump said, his gaze unwavering, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I think you owe the audience and Mrs. Anderson a little more than an apology. The host shifted in his seat, trying to recover his composure. Apology? What are you talking about? Trump didn't flinch. You tried to turn a legitimate concern into a scandal for ratings. But that's not the truth, Matthew. The truth is that the Trump Foundation has been quietly working behind the scenes to help families like Mrs. Anderson's. Families that you would never take the time to understand, let alone care about. Trump's words hung in the air like a challenge. The audience was visibly unsettled. Matthew had no reply. He had been caught in his own trap, and now the truth was coming to light in front of millions of viewers. Let me show you something, Trump continued, flipping through the thick folder he had pulled from under the table. He held it up high for everyone to see. This is the real story, he said, the one you're too busy chasing ratings to tell. The folder contained detailed medical records, copies of bills, and handwritten notes from doctors. Trump laid it all out in front of the camera. His voice never wavered. This is Tommy's story, Trump said. His mother has been struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs to pay for medical tests she couldn't afford. She didn't ask for fame. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for help, and that's what we gave her. Sarah Anderson, still standing in the back row, was crying softly, clutching her folder tightly to her chest. Her tears were no longer just from desperation. Now, they were from a sense of relief she hadn't felt in years. Trump turned his attention back to the camera, addressing the millions watching at home. This isn't about me. This isn't about Barron. This is about people who are struggling every day and the ones who quietly step in to help. These families aren't part of some media circus. They're real people with real problems. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he shifted his focus back to Matthew Johnson. You want to make a spectacle out of a child, but you don't want to talk about the thousands of families we've helped behind the scenes. That's the media's problem, Matthew. They only care about the drama, the noise, and the scandal. But when it comes to real solutions, they're nowhere to be found. Matthew swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable. He had no response. His smug smile, once a tool for undermining others, had faded. The truth was too powerful, and he couldn't fight it. Mrs. Anderson, Trump said, looking toward her with a soft gaze. You and your family don't deserve to be used for ratings. You deserve help, and that's exactly what we've given you. Tommy is going to get the care he needs, and you're not alone in this fight. Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. I never expected anything like this. I just wanted someone to hear me. I never thought it would lead to this, to people actually helping. Trump smiled gently. That's because people like you don't get enough credit. But the work we do, the work that my foundation does, is not about getting credit. It's about making sure that people who need help actually get it. Matthew, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. The crowd was now fully behind Trump, some clapping, others visibly moved by the display of compassion and integrity. It was clear that the host's attempt to create a scandal had backfired in a way he never could have imagined. Now, Trump said, looking at the audience, let's talk about the real issue here. He pointed to the camera. The question isn't whether Barron Trump had a DNA test. The real question is why we don't focus on the people who are making a difference instead of tearing others down. As Trump spoke, the mood in the room shifted. The tension from earlier had dissolved, replaced by a sense of unity. The audience, once divided over the question at hand, now rallied behind the idea that helping others was more important than sensationalizing the lives of public figures. Matthew sat in silence, a defeated expression on his face. He tried to regain control of the interview, but it was clear that the public had already made up their minds. "Let's get back to the issue of DNA testing," Matthew said weakly, attempting to steer the conversation. "What does this really mean for the Trump family?" But Trump wasn't having it. "You can keep pushing your narrative, Matthew, but the truth is what stands. The Trump family doesn't need to prove anything to you. We've proven ourselves with actions, not words." He turned to the camera again, his voice strong and resolute. "And for all the families like Tommy's who are still waiting for help, don't let the noise distract you. We are here, and we're not going anywhere." The moment felt monumental. The host's attempt to create a scandal had not only backfired but had ignited a larger conversation about kindness, responsibility, and the power of actions over words. And then, as the cameras zoomed in on the screen, the familiar face of Barron Trump appeared. His tall figure filled the frame, and the young man smiled warmly at the camera. He spoke directly to Tommy, the boy whose family had been the catalyst for this unexpected turn of events. "Hey, Tommy," Barron said, his voice genuine and kind. "I heard you're part of the Tall Kids Club too. Don't worry, we've got your back." The camera lingered on Barron's face, the sincerity in his words cutting through the tension that had plagued the entire interview. The connection between these two young men, both growing up under intense public scrutiny, was now undeniable. The host tried to regain control one last time, but the moment had passed. The interview had shifted from scandal to something far more powerful: genuine connection and real action. Trump stood tall, a leader who had weathered the storm with grace, showing that the truth, when spoken with conviction, could never be drowned out by noise. The atmosphere in the studio was electric. The attention had shifted from one of conflict to one of quiet reflection. The battle between Matthew Johnson and Donald Trump had now become a war of words, a contest to see who could stand firm in their beliefs despite the overwhelming pressure from the audience and the cameras. Matthew Johnson was still sitting, his face pale, his usual sharp wit replaced by a stunned silence. His plans had failed. He had tried to provoke a scandal but instead had ignited a discussion about real change, about the power of action over media manipulation. Trump, on the other hand, was composed. He had not only defended his family, but had also turned the interview into a showcase for the Trump Foundation's efforts, an organization that had been quietly helping families in need long before this interview. The cameras panned across the room, capturing the faces of the audience members who were slowly beginning to understand the true impact of what was happening. There were no more murmurs of disapproval, no more whispers of doubt. The applause had died down, replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. Trump knew he had won. He had turned the narrative on its head, exposing the truth behind the media's twisted portrayal of his family. But there was still more to be said. "You know, Matthew," Trump said, leaning forward in his seat, "it's funny. You ask about DNA, about Barron, about my family. But what really matters is the people we're helping. The real heroes of this country aren't the ones who sit in studios making accusations. They're the ones who get up every day and do the hard work." Matthew, clearly struggling to regain his composure, finally spoke. "But Mr. Trump, your family has all the money and resources. Isn't there a disconnect between the wealthy elite and the everyday person? Don't you think that contributes to the problems in this country?" Trump's eyes narrowed. He didn't hesitate. "There's a disconnect, all right, but it's not what you think. The real disconnect is between people like you, Matthew, who profit off divisive narratives, and the people working tirelessly to fix the very problems you claim to care about." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Matthew could feel the weight of his own hypocrisy, but he wasn't about to give up. He tried again. "But how can you be sure that the Trump Foundation is doing enough? I mean, you're a businessman. You've built an empire. How do we know this isn't just about PR?" Trump sat back, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Let me tell you something, Matthew. The Trump Foundation doesn't need PR. It needs action, and action is what we've delivered. No cameras, no press releases, just people helping people. When people like Sarah Anderson come to us for help, we don't hesitate. We don't ask for credit. We just do what needs to be done." Sarah, who had been standing quietly in the back, now made her way to the front of the stage. She held her head high, a quiet strength emanating from her as she approached Trump. The gratitude in her eyes was unmistakable. "Mr. Trump," she said softly, but with undeniable conviction, "you've done more for my family than I could ever have imagined. You've made a difference where others just turned their backs. I don't know how to thank you enough." Trump smiled warmly at her. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to know that your son Tommy will have the care he needs, and that's what matters." The audience, who had been watching in silence, began to stir. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were nodding in agreement. They had witnessed something far more powerful than any media scandal. They had seen a man who, despite the constant attacks on his family, was standing up for what he believed in: family, responsibility, and action. Matthew Johnson, however, wasn't ready to let go. He had spent years building his career on stirring up controversy, and he wasn't going to let one interview ruin that. "But Mr. Trump," he pressed, "the public perception of your family is a different story. You've built an empire, but what about the rest of the country? What about the people who are still struggling?" Trump leaned forward again, his voice steady and calm. "The public perception doesn't matter. What matters is what we're doing. You're right, Matthew, there are people who are struggling, but it's not about wealth or privilege. It's about using what you have to make a difference. That's what Barron has been taught, and that's what the Trump Foundation stands for: making a real difference." Matthew opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he had lost this battle. He had tried to manipulate the situation, to spin it into something it wasn't, but the truth had won. Then the cameras cut to a different shot. The screen flashed, and Barron Trump appeared once again. The audience fell silent as they saw the teenager standing tall, his face confident but kind. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice clear and unwavering. "Hi, Tommy. I heard you're part of the Tall Kids Club too. Don't worry, we've got your back. You're not alone in this." The simplicity of the message, the sincerity in Barron's voice, left the room stunned. This wasn't a rehearsed speech or a political statement. It was a young man speaking directly to another, offering support and solidarity. As the screen faded to black, Trump turned to the host one last time. "There's your answer, Matthew. It's not about DNA. It's about what you do when it really matters." The studio erupted in applause, louder than before. The audience was no longer passive observers. They were part of the movement, part of the message that had been conveyed so powerfully. Matthew Johnson sat in stunned silence, the once garish spotlight of his interview now dimmed. He had gone into the conversation thinking he could create a scandal, but instead, he had witnessed the truth unfold before him. "You failed, Matthew," Trump whispered, almost to himself. But it was enough. Trump had already won. And as the camera pulled away, the faces of the audience reflected something that had been lost in the noise of the media: a genuine sense of hope. The applause in the studio slowly died down, but the echoes of the moment lingered. Matthew Johnson, still visibly stunned by the turn of events, shifted uneasily in his seat. He had gone into the interview expecting to break a story, an explosive moment that would make headlines for weeks. But now, in the aftermath of everything that had unfolded, the only headline that seemed relevant was the one he had never expected: "The truth shines through." Donald Trump, however, remained calm. His gaze swept over the room, his posture unwavering. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every movement, every word. But Trump's focus wasn't on the spectacle of it all. His mind was elsewhere, on the people that mattered, the families who had been silently suffering, the individuals who had been overlooked by those who profited from controversy. "Matthew," Trump began, breaking the silence, "this is where we are right now. You wanted to talk about scandal, politics, and my family. But what you're missing is what really matters." He paused, making sure Matthew understood the gravity of his words. "It's not about us. It's about the people who need help and never ask for it. It's about the families like Sarah's and the millions of others who are struggling in silence." Matthew's face tightened, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. He still had one last attempt to gain control of the situation. "But don't you think your actions have always been about creating an image? About shaping public perception? How can you say it's not about you?" Trump didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Matthew. "You keep asking the wrong questions. You want to know about the Trump Foundation's image, but you don't ask about the people whose lives have been changed because of it." His tone was measured but firm. "That's the problem with the media today, Matthew. You care more about the narrative than the reality. The audience sat quietly, each person digesting the weight of what Trump had just said. They could feel the truth behind his words, the authenticity that was impossible to fabricate. Trump's entire demeanor radiated a kind of quiet authority, a force that wasn't interested in playing the media's game of sensationalism. But as the conversation hung in the air, something unexpected happened. From the back of the studio, a man stood up, his voice rising above the rest. He was older, his face lined with years of experience, and he carried an aura of someone who had seen the world through many lenses. His eyes, sharp and direct, were fixed on Trump. "Mr. Trump," the man called out, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "You talk about helping families, about making a difference, but how do you answer the people who think you're just a product of privilege? How do you answer the critics who claim you're using these efforts to win votes, to create a better image?" The room fell silent again, the question hanging like a challenge in the air. Trump turned his attention to the man who had now walked toward the front of the studio. He could feel the weight of the man's words, but he wasn't about to back down. "And who are these critics?" Trump asked. "What have they done to actually help people? What have they done to solve real problems?" The man, his eyes narrowing, didn't flinch. "I'm not here to attack you, Mr. Trump," he said. "But I want to know if you're really willing to put your money where your mouth is, and not just use these efforts as a political tool." Trump sat back in his chair, the intensity of the moment settling in. He knew this wasn't just a question of politics anymore. This was about something much deeper, a test of his character, his values, and the very essence of what he stood for. "What I'm doing, and what we've been doing, isn't about votes or image," Trump said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about doing what's right. And yes, it's about using my platform to make a difference. But it's also about making sure that when families like Sarah's reach out for help, we don't hesitate. We act. And we do it without expecting anything in return." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. "You can call it privilege, you can call it political strategy, but I call it responsibility. Responsibility to help those who can't help themselves. Responsibility to give back to the country that's given so much to me." There was a long silence after Trump spoke. The audience, once skeptical, was now hanging on his every word. The man who had questioned Trump slowly nodded, his expression softening. "I can see you mean it," the man said, his voice quieter now. "Maybe I've been too focused on politics. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time we start talking more about action and less about rhetoric." The shift was palpable. The conversation had gone from a heated debate to a moment of mutual understanding, a realization that perhaps the conversation needed to evolve beyond the usual partisan divide. Trump smiled slightly, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his otherwise stoic expression. "Exactly," he said. "Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want to make this country better. We want to make sure that people aren't left behind." With that, the atmosphere in the studio shifted once again. The underlying tension had dissolved, replaced by a sense of clarity. For the first time during the entire interview, Matthew Johnson was no longer the one in control. Trump had shifted the focus from himself to the people, real people with real problems, and the conversation had taken on a new, more meaningful direction. "And that's the real story," Trump concluded, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "It's not about me. It's about what we can all do together to make a difference." The audience, once divided, was now united in a shared understanding. The applause started slowly at first, but it quickly grew louder, filling the room with the sound of approval and support. This was no longer just an interview. It had become a movement. The applause in the studio had reached a crescendo. The tension that had once defined the atmosphere had all but evaporated. Donald Trump sat back, his expression relaxed, almost contemplative, as the audience continued to applaud. The sound of their approval was a stark contrast to the tense moments earlier when it had seemed like he was on the defensive. But now, it was clear, Trump had won this battle. The cameras shifted, capturing the audience's emotional response. There were tears in some eyes, nodding heads in agreement, and even a few spontaneous cheers. Trump had done something few others could. He had transformed a potentially career-ending interview into a moment of clarity, of leadership, and of compassion. But even with the applause, the battle wasn't over. The interview had now taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the studio. As the final moments of the broadcast played out, the phone lines were already buzzing, social media exploding with reactions. The media, for once, was silent. Back in the control room, Matthew Johnson stood frozen, his hands shaking slightly as he watched the footage. The host who had once been in control now felt completely powerless. He had entered the interview with the intent to expose a scandal, to create a viral moment. Instead, he had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outclassed by a man who had turned every attack into an opportunity to do good. Matthew knew that his career and reputation would never be the same after tonight. But more than that, he realized the media world was changing. The kind of sensationalism he had thrived on was becoming less important. People were hungry for more than just drama. They wanted something real. Meanwhile, Trump's words were creating a ripple effect. Social media was flooded with reactions, some supportive, some critical, but the message was clear. The narrative was shifting. Hashtags like #RealLeadership and #TrumpFoundation were trending worldwide. The Trump Foundation's website saw a huge spike in visitors, eager to learn more about its charitable work. For the first time in a long while, the focus wasn't on the Trump family's personal lives, but on the impact they were making in communities. At home, Sarah Anderson and her son Tommy watched the interview replay on their TV. The moment was sinking in. "I can't believe this," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to us." Tommy, seated beside her, wiped away a tear. "It's not just us, Mom. It's everyone. This is bigger than us." Indeed, it was. People who had been silently struggling with health issues and financial burdens began to feel seen. They realized that there were people out there, people like Donald Trump, who were willing to help. Not for the cameras, not for fame, but because they understood what was at stake. As the interview ended and the credits rolled, the camera took one final shot of the studio. Trump stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The battle for control of the narrative was over, but he knew this was just the beginning. The real work, the work that would define his legacy, was still ahead. He turned to the camera, addressing millions of viewers at home. To all the families out there who are struggling, whether it's with medical bills, with work, with your future, I want you to know that you're not alone. We hear you, and we are doing everything we can to make sure you get the help you need. Trump smiled, his voice firm and resolute. This is just the beginning. Together, we will make America a place where everyone gets a chance to succeed. Not because of your wealth, not because of your last name, but because of your hard work, your values, and your commitment to each other. As months passed, the narrative around Donald Trump began to change. The media, once obsessed with scandal and controversy, struggled to keep people's attention on drama. Instead, the country began focusing on action, results, and leadership that wasn't just about words but about deeds. For Sarah Anderson and her son Tommy, life had drastically improved. The medical treatments they feared they couldn't afford were now covered. The Trump Foundation had not only paid off their debts, but Tommy was receiving the care he needed. Other families in similar situations were beginning to feel the foundation's expanded efforts. People were getting help, not just promises. Trump's message was clear and consistent, and it resonated more than any media spectacle could. It's not about who's in power or whose name is being dragged through the mud, Trump said in his last public speech on the matter. It's about what you do with the power you have and how you use it to lift up those who need it most. The applause for that speech was genuine. The country had seen a man who was once associated with personal ambition now focused on something bigger than himself. It was a shift that many couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Matthew Johnson, the host of the interview that started it all, found himself at a crossroads. The ratings continued to fall, and the public's interest in sensationalism faded. After years of building a career on provocation, Matthew was forced to ask himself, what was the true cost of that success? Donald Trump had shifted the conversation, not just for his own legacy, but for an entire nation. And the world was watching. As we wrap up this journey together, I just want to say thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being here. Your support means more than words can express. If this video touched you, inspired you, or even made you smile, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It's not just a click. It's what keeps this beautiful community growing. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and never stop believing in yourself. I'll see you soon.